Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for more than a decade and believed he had witnessed every possible expression of human emotion on his stage. But on a warm afternoon in late September of 2024, he was about to encounter a revelation so profound and unexpected that it would reduce him to tears and leave his studio audience sitting in stunned silence. The atmosphere carried the typical energy of a game show taping, with two families positioned on stage ready to compete for prize money, cameras recording what everyone anticipated would be another entertaining episode filled with laughter and perhaps a few heartwarming moments. What nobody in that studio could have predicted was that an 87-year-old great-grandfather was about to share the story of his wife's final night on Earth, a story so beautiful and heartbreaking that it would transcend the boundaries of entertainment and become instead a testament to the deepest possible expression of selfless love. Before we continue with this extraordinary account, if you value stories that remind us what love truly means and the lengths to which people will go to care for those they cherish even in their final moments, please take a moment to press that like button and subscribe to our channel, because what you are about to hear represents one of the most powerful demonstrations of unconditional love ever shared on television. The Martinez family from Arizona stood on one side of the stage, their matching burgundy shirts displaying their family name, their expressions reflecting enthusiasm and readiness for the competition ahead. On the opposite side stood the Thompson family from North Carolina, equally prepared and displaying the kind of multi-generational energy that makes Family Feud such compelling viewing. Among the Thompson family members stood someone who immediately commanded attention through sheer presence and the unmistakable dignity that comes from 8.5 decades of lived experience. Robert Thompson was 87 years old, standing with the careful posture of someone who had learned to move deliberately to accommodate the limitations of an aging body. But his eyes remained bright and alert, missing nothing of the activity swirling around him. He wore a crisp white shirt under a navy cardigan that his great-granddaughter had helped him select for this special occasion, and on his left hand, he still wore his wedding ring despite the fact that his wife had passed away 18 months earlier, a visible symbol of a bond that death had not severed in his heart. Robert had been born in 1937 in rural North Carolina, the second of 7 children in a family that worked as tenant farmers, laboring on land they would never own and struggling to make ends meet during the difficult years of the late Depression and World War II. His childhood had been marked by hard physical work from an early age, limited formal education due to the necessity of contributing to the family's survival, and the kind of poverty that shaped every decision and left little room for luxuries or even basic comforts. Despite these hardships, Robert's parents had instilled in their children a strong sense of dignity, a commitment to honesty and hard work, and a faith that sustained them through difficult times. Robert had attended school sporadically, his education constantly interrupted by the demands of planting and harvest seasons, but he had been a quick learner who absorbed knowledge eagerly during the limited time available for formal instruction. By age 14, he was doing the work of a full-grown man, operating farm equipment and taking on responsibilities that would have overwhelmed many adults. When Robert turned 18 in 1955, he made the difficult decision to leave the family farm and seek better opportunities in the growing industrial economy of the post-war South. He found work at a textile mill in a nearby town, operating machinery in conditions that were hot, loud, and dangerous, but that paid wages significantly better than anything available in agricultural labor. He rented a room in a boarding house, sent money home to help support his younger siblings, and began building a life independent of the poverty that had defined his childhood. It was at a church social in 1956 that Robert first encountered Helen Pritchard, a young woman who worked as a seamstress at the same textile mill where Robert operated machinery. Helen was quiet and thoughtful, with a gentle manner that concealed a core of strength and determination. She had grown up in circumstances similar to Robert's, understanding intimately the challenges of poverty and the necessity of hard work for survival. Their courtship developed slowly over months of brief conversations after church services, shared walks through town on Sunday afternoons, and a growing recognition that they had found in each other a partner who understood their background and shared their values. Robert and Helen married in December of 1956 in a simple ceremony at the community church, beginning a partnership that would span 67 years and weather every challenge that life presented. Together, they worked at the textile mill for decades, pooling their modest wages to eventually purchase a small house and raise 4 children in circumstances that, while never affluent, were stable and marked by love, discipline, and consistent emphasis on education and moral character. Robert eventually moved from operating machinery to a supervisory position, while Helen continued her seamstress work both at the mill and later taking in alterations and custom sewing at home to supplement their income. They lived frugally, saved carefully, and prioritized their children's education and opportunities over their own comfort. All 4 of their children graduated from high school, and 3 attended college with the help of their parents' sacrifices, student loans, and part-time work. Robert and Helen watched with pride as their children built professional careers that would have been impossible for people of their own generation from similar backgrounds, becoming a teacher, an accountant, a nurse, and a small business owner. As the decades passed, Robert and Helen's family expanded to include 10 grandchildren and eventually 7 great-grandchildren, a multi-generational legacy that both of them treasured as their greatest achievement. They remained active in their church community throughout their lives, volunteering for various service projects and becoming the kind of steady, reliable presence that every community depends upon. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 2006 with a large family gathering that brought together relatives from across the country, and they looked forward to many more years together, having both maintained relatively good health despite the physical demands of their working lives. But in 2022, Helen began experiencing symptoms that ultimately led to a diagnosis of advanced ovarian cancer, a disease that had apparently been developing silently for months or perhaps years before producing noticeable effects. The prognosis was grim, with doctors estimating she had perhaps 6 to 9 months remaining, and treatment options were limited given both the advanced stage of the disease and Helen's age. Helen faced this news with the same quiet courage she had displayed throughout her life, refusing to waste her remaining time in anger or self-pity, choosing instead to focus on ensuring that Robert and their family would be prepared for her death and able to continue building happy lives after she was gone. She spent her remaining months putting her affairs in order, having important conversations with each of her children and grandchildren, creating photo albums and memory books that would preserve family history for future generations, and most significantly, making careful plans to ensure that Robert would not face the devastating loneliness that so often consumed elderly people after losing a spouse of many decades. Helen understood intimately what her death would mean for Robert, having observed during their 66 years of marriage how completely their lives had become intertwined, how many of their daily routines and sources of meaning depended on their partnership, and how much Robert had come to rely on her presence as the center of his emotional and practical world. As Helen's condition deteriorated and it became clear that her time was measured in weeks rather than months, she made a request to the hospice nurses caring for her. She asked them to inform her when they believed she had reached her final day or two of consciousness, explaining that she had some final preparations to make and wanted to ensure she completed them while she still possessed the mental clarity and physical strength to do so. The hospice nurses, moved by Helen's determination to maintain agency even in her dying, promised they would give her as much advance notice as possible. On a Tuesday evening in March of 2023, the lead hospice nurse told Helen that based on the progression of her symptoms, she likely had only one more night of lucid consciousness remaining before she would slip into the semi-conscious state that typically preceded death by a day or two. Helen thanked the nurse calmly, asked her to help her sit up in bed, and announced that she had work to do and needed everyone except Robert to leave the bedroom for several hours. Robert had been confused and concerned by this request, worried that Helen was experiencing confusion or that her desire for privacy meant she was in more pain than she was admitting. But Helen had looked at him with those clear eyes that he had loved for 67 years and told him firmly but gently that she knew exactly what she was doing, that she was not confused or in unbearable pain, and that she needed this time to complete something important before she lost the ability to do so. She told him to go sit with their children in the living room, to have some dinner, to rest, and that she would call for him when she was ready. Robert, trained by decades of marriage to trust Helen's judgment, even when he did not fully understand her reasoning, had reluctantly agreed. He left the bedroom and joined his children and several grandchildren who had gathered to be present during Helen's final days. They sat together in worried silence, occasionally hearing sounds from the bedroom that suggested Helen was moving around despite her weakness, but respecting her request for privacy, even though every instinct urged them to check on her. After nearly 4 hours, Helen finally called for Robert. When he entered the bedroom, he found her propped up against pillows, exhausted but with an expression of satisfaction and peace on her face. The room had been transformed in ways both subtle and significant. Helen had arranged photographs on every available surface, creating a visual timeline of their life together from their wedding day through recent pictures of great-grandchildren. She had laid out clothing on a chair, specific outfits that Robert recognized as favorites she had always said he looked handsome wearing. She had placed several labeled envelopes on the nightstand, and Robert could see his name written in Helen's increasingly shaky handwriting on the top envelope. Most significantly, she had set up her laptop computer on a rolling table positioned so that Robert could see the screen from the chair beside her bed, and the screen displayed what appeared to be a video file ready to play. Helen gestured for Robert to sit beside her, and when he had settled into the chair, she took his hand with a grip that was weak but determined. She told him that she had spent the past 4 hours preparing for what came next, not her own death, which was now inevitable and imminent, but rather his continued life, which was equally inevitable and which she had decided needed her guidance and planning just as much as their shared life had benefited from her practical wisdom and foresight over 67 years. She told him that in the envelopes were letters, each labeled with specific instructions about when they should be opened and read. Some were addressed to him, others to their children or grandchildren, and each contained thoughts, memories, and instructions that she wanted to share, but had not found the right moment to express while she was still alive and distracted by the daily tasks of living and dying. Then Helen told Robert about the video file on the laptop, explaining that she had spent the past 4 hours recording herself speaking directly to him about topics that she needed him to hear and understand before she died. She said the video was quite long, nearly 3 hours, and that she did not expect him to watch it tonight while she was still alive, because some of what she needed to say would be too difficult for him to hear in her presence. She instructed him to watch the video after her death, preferably after the funeral when the immediate crisis had passed, and he had time and emotional space to truly absorb what she wanted to tell him. She made him promise that he would watch it alone the first time, without their children present, because some of what she had recorded was private between husband and wife, and needed to be received in that intimate context before being potentially shared with others. Robert had started to cry, overwhelmed by the realization that Helen was saying goodbye, that these were likely her final coherent words to him, and that after 67 years of constant companionship, he was about to face an existence without her presence. Helen had squeezed his hand as tightly as her weakening grip allowed, and told him something that he would remember for the rest of his life. She said that she was not afraid of dying because she had lived a good life filled with love and meaning, but that she was desperately afraid of leaving him alone to navigate the grief and loneliness that she knew would overwhelm him after her death. She said that the video she had recorded was her attempt to guide him through that grief, to give him permission for things he would need to do to survive and eventually thrive, and to express love and gratitude that she feared would be inadequately conveyed in the limited time remaining to them. Helen died 36 hours later, slipping away peacefully with Robert holding her hand just as he had held it throughout their marriage. The funeral was well attended, a testament to the quiet but significant impact that Helen and Robert had made in their community over decades of steady, reliable presence and service. In the days immediately following the funeral, Robert moved through his grief in a fog of numbness and automatic routine, supported by his children who took turns staying with him and ensuring he ate meals and took care of basic needs. 2 weeks after Helen's death, his children returned to their own homes and responsibilities, and Robert found himself alone in the house for the first time in 67 years. It was then that he remembered Helen's video, the 3-hour recording she had made during her final night of consciousness, and he decided that the time had come to watch whatever message she had left for him. Robert set up the laptop at the kitchen table, made himself a cup of coffee despite the late evening hour, and clicked play on the video file. Helen's face filled the screen, and even though she had clearly been exhausted and in pain when recording, her expression was focused and determined. She began by telling Robert that she loved him more than she had ever successfully expressed in words during their life together, that marrying him had been the best decision she ever made, and that she had no regrets about the life they had built together despite its material limitations and inevitable challenges. Then she told him that what she was about to say would be difficult for him to hear, but that she needed him to listen with an open mind and heart. Remembering that everything she was about to express came from a place of deep love and concern for his well-being after she was gone, Helen told Robert that she knew him better than anyone else ever had or ever would, knew his strengths and weaknesses, knew his fears and hopes, knew the ways he had relied on her to manage certain aspects of their life together that he had never been comfortable handling alone. She said she knew that without her, he would struggle with loneliness so profound that it could destroy him, that he would retreat into isolation and grief, that he would stop taking care of himself properly, and that within a few years, he would likely follow her into death. Not because of physical illness necessarily, but because of the kind of emotional and spiritual despair that could literally will a person out of existence. She said she could not bear the thought of that outcome, could not accept that her death might indirectly cause his premature death, and that she had therefore spent her final night of consciousness developing a plan that she needed him to follow. Helen's plan, revealed gradually over the 3-hour video, was both shocking and beautiful in its comprehensiveness and attention to detail. She told Robert that she wanted him to find another companion, preferably someone who could eventually become a romantic partner, and perhaps even a second wife if the relationship developed in that direction. She anticipated his immediate emotional rejection of this idea and addressed it directly, explaining that her request was not about replacing her or diminishing what they had shared, but rather about ensuring that he had someone to share his life with, someone to talk to in the evenings, someone to cook meals with and watch television beside, someone who could provide the daily companionship that human beings need to thrive. She told him that she had given this considerable thought and had concluded that his best option for finding such a companion would be through his church community, where he might meet widows of similar age who were also navigating loneliness and grief. Helen went further, providing Robert with specific advice about how to approach this search for companionship. She told him what qualities to look for in a potential partner, what warning signs to watch for that might indicate incompatibility or problematic behavior, how to have honest conversations about expectations and boundaries, and how to introduce a new person into their family in a way that would minimize conflict with children and grandchildren who might have complicated feelings about their father pursuing a relationship so soon after their mother's death. She told him that she had already spoken to each of their children privately before her death, informing them of her wishes that Robert seek companionship and asking them to support him in this endeavor, rather than making him feel guilty or disloyal. She told him that she had written a letter to his future companion, whoever that person might be, thanking her in advance for bringing joy and companionship back into Robert's life, and assuring her that Helen harbored no jealousy or resentment, but only gratitude that someone would care for her husband after she could no longer do so herself. But Helen's plan extended beyond romantic companionship. She had also used her final night to organize Robert's future in other ways. She walked him through the practical details of managing their household without her, providing detailed written instructions about bill paying, home maintenance schedules, medical appointments, and daily routines that she had always handled. She had created a meal planning system with simple recipes that she knew he could manage, had organized their finances into clearly labeled folders with instructions about what needed to be paid when, and had even pre-addressed Christmas cards to family members with notes about what she typically wrote in each one so he could maintain family connections without feeling overwhelmed by the social management she had always performed. She had thought through every aspect of his life that would become more difficult without her presence, and had attempted to provide guidance and systems to help him navigate those challenges. Most profoundly, Helen had used her final hours of consciousness to record dozens of short video messages meant to be watched on specific future occasions. She had created a folder on the laptop labeled "For Later" with subfolders for different occasions, including birthdays, anniversaries, major holidays, and significant family events. She told Robert that on his next birthday, he should watch the video labeled "Juck Your Birthday Without Me." When their first great-great-grandchild was eventually born, he should watch the message she had recorded for that milestone. When he felt overwhelmed by grief and loneliness, there were specific videos offering comfort and encouragement. When he achieved something worth celebrating, there were videos sharing in his joy. Helen had essentially attempted to extend her presence beyond her death, providing Robert with her voice and her love for dozens of future moments when he would need to hear from her. Robert had watched the entire 3-hour video that night, crying through most of it, overwhelmed by the depth of Helen's love and the extraordinary effort she had made during her final conscious hours to care for him even after her death. In the 18 months since Helen's passing, Robert had followed her guidance. He had joined a grief support group at his church, where he met other widows and widowers. He had watched Helen's videos on the occasions she had specified, finding comfort in seeing her face and hearing her voice offering thoughts tailored to each specific moment. He had begun having coffee regularly with a woman named Joyce, whom he had met at the grief support group, a 79-year-old widow who had lost her husband of 52 years to Alzheimer's disease 2 years earlier. The friendship had developed slowly and carefully, with both Robert and Joyce navigating the complex emotions of forming new connections while still grieving their late spouses. Robert had showed Joyce the letter Helen had written to her future companion, and Joyce had cried at the generosity and love expressed in Helen's words, welcoming her into Robert's life. Now standing on the Family Feud stage 18 months after Helen's death, Robert carried in his wallet a small photograph of Helen and a printed copy of one particular passage from her 3-hour video that he read whenever he needed strength or reassurance. His participation in Family Feud had been Joyce's suggestion, proposed as a way for Robert to create new memories with his family while honoring Helen's wish that he continue living fully rather than retreating into isolated grief. His children and grandchildren had embraced the idea enthusiastically, seeing the game show appearance as exactly the kind of positive, life-affirming activity their mother would have wanted for their father. They had applied as a family, been selected, and made the trip to California as a multi-generational group that now included Joyce, who had accompanied them as Robert's companion and friend, with the full support and encouragement of the Thompson family. Steve Harvey began his introduction of the families with his characteristic energy and warmth, clearly delighted by the multi-generational composition of both competing families. When he reached Robert, Steve paused with obvious respect, taking in the elderly man who was clearly the patriarch of his family. Steve asked Robert his age, and when Robert replied that he was 87, the audience responded with enthusiastic applause. Steve commented on how wonderful it was to see someone of Robert's age looking engaged and vital, and he asked what brought Robert to Family Feud at this stage of life. Robert smiled and explained that his late wife Helen had always wanted their family to do something fun and memorable together, and that he was here fulfilling her wish even though she had passed away 18 months ago. He mentioned that his companion Joyce, gesturing to where she sat in the audience, had encouraged him to apply because Helen would have wanted him to continue creating new experiences rather than dwelling in grief. Steve's expression softened with compassion, and he expressed condolences for Robert's loss, while praising his attitude toward honoring Helen's memory through continued engagement with life and family. Then Steve asked a question that would open the door to the revelation that would transform the entire atmosphere in the studio. He asked Robert how long he and Helen had been married, and what the secret to such a long partnership had been. Robert's face changed as he prepared to answer, a complex mixture of grief, love, and profound emotion crossing his features. He told Steve that he and Helen had been married for 67 years, that the secret to their marriage had been Helen's extraordinary capacity for unconditional love and selfless caring, and that even in her final hours of consciousness, Helen had been focused not on her own impending death, but on ensuring that he would be able to continue living well after she was gone. Steve, sensing there was something significant beneath Robert's words, encouraged him to elaborate. Robert took a deep breath and began to describe Helen's final night, explaining how she had spent those last precious hours of consciousness not saying goodbye, but rather preparing for his future, creating systems and guidance to help him navigate life without her. The studio audience grew quiet as Robert's story unfolded, the weight of what he was describing settling over everyone present. Robert's voice grew thick with emotion as he described the 3-hour video Helen had recorded, walking him through her plan for his life after her death including her explicit wish and detailed guidance about finding new companionship so he would not face devastating loneliness. He explained how Helen had thought through every practical aspect of his future life, had created video messages for dozens of future occasions, and had even written a letter to his future companion welcoming her into his life and thanking her in advance for caring for him. Steve Harvey stood completely still, his mouth slightly open, his eyes beginning to glisten with tears as Robert's story continued. Robert explained that he was standing on this stage today in part because of Helen's planning and foresight, that she had understood he would need structure and purpose after her death, that she had anticipated his tendency to withdraw into isolation, and that she had essentially created a roadmap for his grieving process that included explicit milestones and goals designed to keep him engaged with life and family. He told Steve that the woman sitting in the audience, Joyce, was someone he had met following Helen's guidance, and that Helen's letter to his future companion had been instrumental in helping Joyce understand that forming a relationship with him was not a betrayal of either of their late spouses, but rather an honoring of the love those spouses had wanted them to continue experiencing. The studio was now completely silent, except for the sounds of people quietly crying. Steve Harvey's face was contorted with emotion, tears running openly down his cheeks as he struggled to maintain his professional composure. When Robert finished speaking, Steve stood motionless for several long seconds, seemingly unable to find words adequate to the profound expression of love he had just heard described. Finally, Steve's voice emerged rough and broken, barely above a whisper. He told Robert that in all his years in entertainment, in all his experiences with thousands of families and countless personal stories, he had never heard anything that matched what Helen had done during her final night of consciousness. He said that Helen's actions represented the purest and most selfless expression of love he could imagine, that her decision to spend her last hours preparing for Robert's future rather than focusing on her own approaching death was extraordinary beyond measure. Steve turned to address the cameras and the studio audience, tears still streaming down his face as he struggled to articulate what everyone was feeling. He said that what Robert had just shared transcended anything he had ever witnessed on his show, that Helen's story needed to be heard and absorbed by everyone because it represented a profound lesson about what love truly means. He said that real love was not about possessing someone or keeping them bound to your memory after death, but rather about caring so deeply for their well-being that you actively worked to ensure they would thrive even without your presence. He said that Helen's willingness to encourage Robert to find new companionship, to provide detailed guidance about how to do so, and to welcome his future partner with gratitude rather than jealousy, represented a level of spiritual and emotional maturity that few people ever achieved. Steve then did something unprecedented. He announced that he was stopping the game show taping, that what had just occurred was too important to treat as merely a segue into entertainment, and that everyone present needed to take a moment to fully absorb and honor what they had just witnessed. The production team looked shocked, but did not protest, recognizing that they had captured something far more valuable than standard game show content. Steve asked Robert if Joyce would be willing to come on stage, and Robert called for her. Joyce, a small, silver-haired woman with a gentle demeanor, made her way onto the stage looking overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Steve asked Joyce how she felt when Robert showed her Helen's letter, and Joyce's response was equally moving. She said that Helen's letter had given her permission to love again without guilt, that Helen's generosity of spirit had made it possible for her to open her heart to Robert while still honoring her own late husband's memory, and that she thought of Helen every day with gratitude for the gift of welcoming her into Robert's life. The game show eventually continued, though the energy had shifted to something more tender and reflective than the typical Family Feud atmosphere. The Thompson family competed and ultimately won their game, advancing to fast money, where Robert insisted on taking one of the two positions. He performed remarkably well, contributing to a total score that easily surpassed the 200-point threshold and secured the $20,000 prize for his family. When the victory was confirmed, Steve announced that he would personally match the prize money, donating $40,000 to hospice organizations in Helen's name to honor her extraordinary final gift to her husband. The audience's standing ovation lasted several minutes, with many people openly weeping at the emotional weight of everything they had witnessed. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate, overwhelming, and deeply emotional. The clip of Robert describing Helen's final night went viral within hours, viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. Comments poured in from viewers describing how Helen's story had changed their understanding of love, had inspired them to have difficult conversations with their own spouses about death and future happiness, and had given them permission to pursue new relationships after loss without feeling guilty or disloyal. Hospice organizations reported receiving thousands of inquiries from patients asking for guidance about how to prepare final gifts for their loved ones similar to what Helen had created. Grief counselors began using Helen's story as an example of how the dying can help prepare the surviving for continued life, and how explicit permission and guidance from a deceased spouse could significantly ease the guilt and conflict many people experience when considering new relationships after loss. The videos Helen had created, particularly the letter to Robert's future companion, became the subject of widespread discussion and analysis. Relationship experts praised Helen's approach as a model for how couples should think about death and survival within long-term partnerships. Religious leaders used her story in sermons about selfless love and the proper way to honor marriage vows, which include caring for your spouse's well-being even after death separates you. Psychologists studied the impact of Helen's planned approach to Robert's grief, noting that the structure and guidance she provided had demonstrably helped him navigate bereavement more successfully than many widowers manage. Filmmakers approached Robert about creating a documentary about Helen's final gift, hoping to preserve and share her story in a way that could benefit others facing similar circumstances. Robert himself became an advocate for open conversations about death, dying, and preparation for the surviving spouse within long-term marriages. He began speaking at senior centers, churches, and hospice organizations, sharing Helen's story and encouraging couples to have honest discussions about their wishes for their partner's life after death. He always brought with him the photograph of Helen and portions of her videos, allowing audiences to see and hear her warmth and wisdom directly. He explained that Helen's gift had not eliminated his grief, but had provided a framework for processing that grief constructively, rather than allowing it to consume him. He talked openly about his relationship with Joyce, explaining how Helen's letter had made it possible for both of them to form a connection without the guilt and conflict that typically complicate new relationships after loss. The letter Helen had written to Robert's future companion became particularly influential. Joyce allowed it to be published with identifying details removed, and it was widely shared in grief support communities and end-of-life planning resources. Helen's words, expressing gratitude to someone she would never meet for bringing joy and companionship back into Robert's life, represented such an extraordinary act of generosity that many people described reading it as a transformative experience that changed their understanding of what it meant to truly love someone. The letter included specific passages where Helen acknowledged how difficult it would be for Robert's new partner to navigate the complex emotions of forming a relationship with a widower, assured her that Helen harbored no jealousy or resentment from beyond the grave, and explicitly gave her blessing and encouragement for the relationship to develop into whatever brought Robert happiness and companionship. 2 years after the Family Feud appearance, Robert and Joyce decided to marry, a decision they made with the full support and encouragement of both families. At their wedding, now 89 and 81 years old respectively, they incorporated Helen and Joyce's late husband into the ceremony through photographs, readings from letters both had written encouraging their spouses to find new love, and explicit acknowledgement that their marriage was not a replacement of their previous partnerships, but rather a continuation of the love and companionship both had been blessed to experience in their earlier marriages. The ceremony was profoundly moving, with many guests commenting that they had never attended a wedding where the presence and blessing of deceased former spouses was so openly honored and celebrated. Robert and Joyce both spoke during the ceremony about how Helen's final gift had made their relationship possible, how her wisdom and foresight had provided a roadmap for them to follow, and how they intended to honor both Helen and Joyce's late husband by building a partnership characterized by the same selfless love and mutual care that had defined their previous marriages. Robert continued to watch Helen's videos on the occasions she had specified, sharing some of them with Joyce when the content seemed appropriate for both of them to experience together. 3 years after Helen's death, Robert watched the video she had recorded to be viewed after he had found new companionship and formed a serious relationship. In that video, Helen expressed her joy and relief that he had followed her guidance, told him she was proud of his courage in opening his heart again, and gave him explicit permission to be fully present and committed in his new relationship, without reserving parts of himself out of misplaced loyalty to her memory. She told him that she wanted him to be happy, that happiness would honor her more than perpetual mourning ever could, and that she would be watching over both him and his new partner with love and blessing. Robert and Joyce watched that video together, both of them crying at Helen's generosity and at the profound gift she had given them through her careful planning during her final hours of consciousness. The story of Helen Thompson and her final night of consciousness became a cultural touchstone referenced in discussions about love, death, grief, and the ethical questions surrounding new relationships after loss. Medical ethicists studied her approach as a model for how dying patients could use their final time to provide structure and support for surviving loved ones. End-of-life doulas and hospice workers began incorporating discussions about legacy planning that went beyond financial matters to include emotional and relational guidance for survivors. Marriage counselors used Helen's story to encourage couples to have frank discussions about their wishes for their partner's future after death, breaking through the taboo that often prevents such conversations until it is too late for careful planning. And countless individuals who watched that Family Feud episode or heard about Helen's final gift found themselves inspired to think differently about what it meant to love someone completely, understanding that truly caring for another person's well-being sometimes meant actively preparing for your own absence and encouraging them to find happiness even when you could no longer be part of that happiness. If this story of a dying woman who spent her final conscious hours preparing her husband for a future without her, including explicitly encouraging and guiding him toward new companionship, has moved you to tears or changed your understanding of what love truly means, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with couples who need to have difficult conversations about death and survival, with widows and widowers struggling with guilt about moving forward, and with anyone who needs to understand that the deepest expression of love sometimes means caring more about your partner's future happiness than about preserving your own memory as the eternal center of their emotional world. Helen Thompson taught us that real love is not possessive or jealous, but rather generous and forward-thinking, focused on the beloved's well-being even after death separates you. She demonstrated that the dying have the power to shape how the surviving grieve and rebuild, and that thoughtful planning and explicit permission can make an enormous difference in helping bereaved spouses navigate the complex emotions of continuing to live and even love again after loss. Most importantly, Helen showed us that your final hours can be spent not just saying goodbye, but rather saying hello to your loved one's future, preparing them to thrive rather than merely survive, and giving them the greatest possible gift, which is freedom from guilt and a roadmap toward continued joy and connection. Thank you for witnessing this remarkable testament to selfless love, and may we all aspire to care for those we love with even a fraction of the wisdom, generosity, and foresight that Helen Thompson displayed during her final night on Earth.